These are the books I bought to give to my 6-year-old granddaughter and my 10-year-old grandson. I'd like to read them to you first. And Piggy. You'd like to hear the stories too, wouldn't you, darling? Okay, so the teddies are here also. And this is the story of Esio, Trot. I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's really what you want. Have you ever had a tortoise at your house or in your garden? Mr. Hoppy lived in a small flat, high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He had always been a lonely man, and now he was retired from work. He was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs. And baskets. And in the summer, the little balcony became a riot of colour. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr. Hoppy's jutted out a good bit further from the building than his own, so Mr. Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an attractive middle-aged lady called Mrs. Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who also lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love. He had loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was a very shy man, and had never been able to bring himself to give even the smallest hint of his love. Every morning, Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver exchanged polite conversation, and the one looking down from above, the other looking up. But that was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but Mr. Hoppy, it seemed, like 1,000,000 miles. He longed to invite Mrs. Silver up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him, and as I said, he was a very shy man. The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all her love to somebody else, and that somebody was a small tortoise called Alfie. Every day, when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments to Alfie and stroking his shell, he felt absurdly jealous. There he is. He wouldn't even have minded becoming a tortoise himself if it meant Mrs. Silver stroking his shell each morning and whispering endearments to him. Little endearments. Oh, what a lovely tortoise you are. I do love you so. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on her balcony summer and winter. Planks had been placed around the sides of the balcony so that Alfie could walk about without toppling over the edge, and in one corner there was a little house into which Alfie would crawl every night to keep warm. When the colder weather came along in November, Mrs. Silver would fill Alfie's house with dry hay, and the tortoise would crawl in and there and bury himself deep underneath the hay and go to sleep for months on end. Oh, I didn't know that tortoise hibernated all winter. Yeah, without food or water. This is called hibernating. In early spring, when Alfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony, and Mrs. Silver would clap her hands with joy and cry out, "Welcome back, my darling one. My darling one, welcome back. Oh, how I've missed you." It was at times like these that Mrs. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with with Alfie, and become a tortoise. You know any tortoises, eh? Are there tortoises where you live? And he says, "No, I live here with the bears. I don't live out there in the wilds." Okay. Now we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over the balcony rail, watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast. "Here's the heart of the lettuce for you, my lovely," she was saying, "and here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crispy celery. Good morning." "Good morning, Mrs. Silver," Mr. Hoppy said. "Alfie's looking well this morning. Isn't he gorgeous?" Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. There he is. He's up there looking down and she's down there looking up. "Absolutely gorgeous," Mr. Hoppy said, not meaning it. And now, as he looked down at Mrs. Silver's smiling, gazing up into his own, he thought for 1,000th time how pretty she was, how gentle and sweet and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love. "I do wish he would grow a little faster," Mrs. Silver was saying. "Every spring he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales. And do you know that in all the 11 years I've had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces. It's almost nothing." "What does he weigh now?" Mr. Hoppy asked her. "Just 13 ounces, Mrs. Silver answered. "About as much as a grapefruit." "Yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers," Mr. Hoppy said solemnly, "but they can live for 100 years. "I know that," said Mrs. Silver, But I do wish he would grow just a little bigger. He's such a tiny wee fellow." "He is such a tiny wee fellow." "He seems just fine as he is," Mr. Hoppy said. "No, he's not just fine," Mrs. Silver cried. "Try to think how miserable it must be. Make him feel so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up." "You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you?" Mr. Hoppy said, and even as he said it, his mind suddenly went click, and an amazing idea came rushing into his mind. "Of course I would," Mrs. Silver cried. "I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy." Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here surely was his big chance. "Grab it," he told himself. "Grab it quick." Mrs. Silver said, "I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster," he said, "if that's what you really want." "You do?" she cried. "Oh, please tell me. Am I feeding him the wrong things? I worked in Africa once, Mr. Hoppy said. That's where all those tortoises in England come from, and a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret. Tell me, cried Mrs. Silver. I beg you to tell me. Mr. Hoppy, I'll be your slave for life. When he heard the words, your slave for life, a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. Wait there, he said. I'll have to go in and write something down for you. In a couple of minutes, Mr. Hoppy was back on the balcony with a sheet of paper and a bit of string. He said, or it might blow away. Here it comes. Mrs. Silver caught the paper and held it up in front of her. This is what she read. Esio, Trot, reg, regib, emok, no, Esio, Trot. Wog, poo, poo, tooth, poo, grips, poo, was, poo. Lud poo, egro, elzug, plug, tup, no, taff, Esio, Trot, tup, no, taff, teg, no, elbog, toof. Goodness gracious, what does it mean, she asked. Is it another language? It's tortoise language, Mr. Hoppy said. Tortoises are very backward creatures. Therefore, they can only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious, isn't it? I suppose so, Mrs. Silver said, bewildered. Esio Trot is simply tortoise spelt backwards. Mr. Hoppy said, look at it. So it is, Mrs. Silver said. The other words are spelt backwards too. Mr. Hoppy said, if you turn them around into human language, they simply say, tortoise, tortoise, get bigger, bigger, come on, tortoise, grow up, puff up, shoot up, gorge, guzzle, stuff, gulp, put on fat, tortoise, put on fat, get on, gobble food. Wow. Mrs. Silver examined the magic words on the paper more closely. I guess you're right, she said. How clever. But there's an awful lot of poos in it. Are they something special? Poo is a very strong word in any language, Mr. Hoppy said, especially with tortoises. Now, what you have to do, Mrs. Silver, is hold Alfie up to your face and whisper those words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon and night. Let me hear you practice them. Very slowly and stumbling a little over the strange words, Mrs. Silver read the words in the message aloud. Not bad, Mr. Hoppy said, but try to get a little more expressive into it. When you say Alfie, if you do it properly, I'll bet you anything you like that in a few months he will be twice as big as he is now. I'll try it, Mrs. Silver said. I'll try anything, of course I will, but I can't believe it'll work. Wait and see, Mr. Hoppy said, smiling at her. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. Your slave for life, he kept repeating to himself. What bliss! But there was a lot of work to be done before this happened. The only furniture Mr. Hoppy had in his small living room was a table and 2 chairs. And these he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect the carpet. Next, he got out a telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them together. Yeah, that was right. In the good old days, people used to write with a pen and paper after they looked up the telephone in the big telephone directory, and then they would pick up their phone and dial the number. I know. We just do it all on our mobiles now, don't we? It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose the tortoises. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them very carefully. To you and me, there is not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in their colour and their shells. Alfie had a darkish shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker shelled tortoises for his collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie's, 13 ounces, others a great deal more. But he didn't want any that weighed less. Feed them cabbage leaves, the pet shop owner told him. That's all they need, and a bowl of water. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy... I'm just going to put that... in his enthusiasm, had brought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips, and he was quite exhausted at the end of it. But it was all worth it. Boy, was it worth it. And what an amazing sight his living room was when they were all in it together. The floor was swarming with tortoises of different sizes, some walking slowly about, some exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from a big shallow bowl. They made just the faintest rustling around as they moved over the canvas sheets. But that was all Mr. Hoppy had to do. It was all Mr. had to pick up his way carefully. Hang on a minute. They made just the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet. But that was all. Mr. Hoppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes between this moving sea of small brown shells. He walked across the room, but enough of that. He must get on with the job. Goodness gracious, he's really bought 120. No, 140 he bought. He needed that many? Can you guess what his plan is? Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage. And now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or so. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. That was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. Oh, no. That's his picker-upper. First he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and these were attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down the inside of the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed. And when you pushed them, the claws opened. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. There it is. There it is, dangling down from his upper balcony to Mrs. Silver's lower balcony. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So on the first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You're about to go for a little ride." He wriggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the 2 claws neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like 2 fingers of a hand. He hauled Alfie up onto his balcony. It was easy. Oh dear. Oh dear, I think he's a little bit frightened. He didn't expect that to happen, did he? Suddenly just minding his own business. Oh, he's going for a ride up in the air. Goodness. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct, and it was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that first of all had the same colour shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces? Okay. 2 ounces is not much. It's less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But, you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice at all. From his vast collection, it was not too difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more, no less. When he got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out on the balcony and gripped it with his claws. Then he lowered it onto Mrs. Silver's balcony, right beside a nice fresh lettuce. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment. Out on to her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Alfie, my darling," she cried out, "Mummy's back. Have you missed me?" Mr. Hoppy, peering over his railing, but well hidden between 2 large potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away on the lettuce. My, Alfie, you do seem hungry today," Mrs. Silver was saying. It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you." Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked up the tortoise and stroked his shell. When she finished, she got the piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading the paper, Esio, Trot, Teg, red jib, E mock no, Esio, Trot, Wog, Poo, Pop, Poo, Toof, Poo, Gips, Poo, Wog, Poo, El, Poo, Egg, Rog, El, Zug, Fitz, Plug, Tup, no, Tap, Esio, Trot, Tup, no, Tap, Teg, no, El, Bog, Toof. They sound nonsensical, don't they? Do they sound magical to you? She wanted them to be magical, didn't she? Mrs. Hoppy popped his head out of the foliage and called out, "Good evening, Mrs. Silver. How's Alfie tonight?" "Oh, he's lovely," Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming, "and he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words." "You never know," Mr. Hoppy said darkly. "You never know." Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, He lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces. 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection he found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the shells matched in colour. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry. So, this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of the week, tortoise number 2, weight 15 ounces. End of second week, tortoise number 3, 17 ounces. End of third week, tortoise number 4, 19 ounces. End of week 4, tortoise number 5, weight 21 ounces. End of the fifth week, number 6, tortoise number 6 weighed 23 ounces. Goodness gracious, end of 6, and there he is, number 7, weighing 25 ounces. Well, that's nearly double, isn't it? And look, end of the 7th week. Can he even fit in his little house anymore? This number 8 one is 27 ounces. That's more than double. Very slow over 7 weeks. Mr. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. What do you mean she hadn't noticed a thing? What? Of course she had, because she'd been... Even Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing. Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she said. She'd looked up. "You know, Mr. Happy, I do believe he's getting bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had actually answered. Surely she's weighed him if she thought he was looking bigger, and she's talking to him like that with all those magic words. Come on. But now, perhaps, it was time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mr. Silver that she ought to weigh Alfie, when a startled cry from the balcony below him brought him outside fast. "Look!" Mrs. Silver was shouting. "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously. Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in a half a minute she was back, holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before. Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great, big, wonderful boy. Just look what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I would pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs, and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a big, good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a miracle man." "You are indeed. But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. "He must have a house to go into at night, but how can he get through that door?" They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise, who was trying to push his way into his house. He was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door, Mrs. Silver," Mrs. Silver said. Don't do that, Mr. Hoppy said. You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he needs only to be just a tiny bit smaller, and he could easily get in. How can he possibly get smaller? That's simple, Mr. Hoppy said. Change the magic words and telling him to get bigger. Tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course. Will that work? Of course it'll work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy. Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pen. Piece of paper and pencil and wrote, Esio Trot, Teg a tib relums a tib relums. That'll do it. Mrs. Silver, he said, handing her the paper. I don't mind trying it, Mrs. Silver said, but look here, I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hoppy. He won't, dear lady, he won't. Mr. Hoppy said, say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky. If it works, Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, then you are the cleverest man alive. The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller, so that it would just go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again, he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to wait Mrs. Silver to come home. There he is. Goodness gracious. He's at it again. Well, that evening Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver's shout from below, shrill with excitement. Mr. Hoppy, where are you?" she was shouting. "Just look at this." Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, "What's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it's worked," she was crying. "Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through the door to his little house. It's a miracle." "Can I come down and look?" Mr. Hoppy shouted. "Come down at once, my dear man," Mrs. Silver answered. "Come down and see the wonders. You have worked upon my darling Alfie." Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the sea of tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew down the stairs, 2 at a time, with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. "This is it," he whispered to himself under his breath. "The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep very calm." When he was 3/4 way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried, "You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met." "You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. It's the very least you deserve." Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silver's parlour, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, please will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy," she cried, "I didn't think you'd ever get around to asking. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. "It's all due to Alfie," Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. "Good old Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "We'll keep him forever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all of his other tortoises back up to the pet shop and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. After a few weeks, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived happily ever after. I thought it was going to be a tale about a tortoise. P.S. I expect you're wondering what happened to little Alfie. The first of them all. Well, he was brought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta Quibb, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated in a box of dried leaves in the tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta's grown up and is now married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her, still the very much loved family pet, and Roberta reckons that by now he must be about 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow to twice the size he was when Mrs. Silver had him. But he made it in the end. Yeah, slow old tortoises, aren't they? Oh, well, that was a lovely story, and I might not have read it if I didn't have you to read it too. So thank you for that. Did you like it too? Yes. Bye for now.